Well, thank you, Robert. Just by show of hands, how many people were not here last night? Wow, all right. So we're going to do just one or two slides of review. I promise for those of you who were here, there's only going to be 3 repeat slides. I've titled what I want to share this morning, The Coming Rural Renaissance, and how the tools of economic development can pollinate it. And that's why I have the little B there, because pollinators is a big part of the theme. I have a new book coming out. Unfortunately, it's not available today. It's coming out in a month, and it's all about pollinators. So you're going to get a little bit of a taste of what pollinators could do. And while I didn't arrange to have your economic development establishment fired last night, it isn't just a problem, it's an opportunity. It's an invitation for all of us to begin to take on the tasks of economic development as individuals and as business people and at a really grassroots level. So the themes that I'm touching on today really give you a blueprint of what you can do in the face of this thing that could otherwise be perceived as a calamity. Last night, after sharing a few thoughts about the Ivany report, I suggested there were 3 rules that we know work for prosperity in communities. Number 1, maximize local ownership, maximize the percentage of people in your community working in locally owned businesses, because locally owned businesses are far better contributors. We know this empirically, far better contributors to economic development than non-local businesses. Doesn't mean non-local businesses are bad. It just means that with limited dollars and time, focusing on the things that deliver more makes more sense. Second, we want to emphasize local self-reliance, not as a way of detaching or defecting from the global economy, but as a way of engaging with the global economy from a position of strength. Because even if you believe, as the Ivany report suggests, that exports are key for prosperity, the best way to developing export strength is import replacement. That is, through local self-reliance, you develop all kinds of businesses that then begin to reach out to the rest of the world. Finally, we want to focus on businesses that are mindful of the triple bottom line. We don't care about just any local business. We want local businesses that are good to their workforce, good to their suppliers, good to the environment. We all know these examples are out there. We need to build on that. A theme in the Ivany report, a theme that certainly we get in the news all the time, is that rural communities are collapsing. And indeed, there is lots of bad news across North America. Losses of jobs, losses of business, people moving out, especially young people who leave right after high school graduation. As people move out, there's less of a tax base for social services. Those who remain in rural communities are getting older, which means the productive base is in some sense declining. And there may be in many rural communities a sense of despair. That's kind of the bad news case about rural communities. But I think all of us here sense that the story is incomplete, that actually there is a lot of good news to share about rural communities as well. And in the United States, over the last few years, actually 1/3 of our rural communities have experienced population growth. 2/3 have experienced decline. So in at least 1/3 of our rural communities, some good things are happening. I want to give you one example of a rural community that pulled itself out of the depths, and it comes from Austria. It's a town called Güssing, which has about 4,000 people. Historically, Güssing was an agriculture, forestry town. They were experiencing greater poverty and unemployment. And then they elected a mayor in the mid-1990s who said the key to prosperity is we've got to become self-reliant in something. They decided to focus on energy. So using wood from the old forestry industry, they created a self-reliant district heating system that supported a bunch of buildings in Güssing. Now, as a result of this district heating system, they were a little bit less dependent on outside imports of oil and natural gas and coal, and that saved them money. Well, what did they do with that additional money? They invested it in another energy business, and then another, and another, and another. 15 years later, Güssing had 100 new energy businesses that had produced about 1,000 new jobs. And in doing so, they brought down their carbon footprint by 95%. Now, energy is just one of many ways that a community can become fabulously wealthy through greater self-reliance. And I would say that when you look at stories like that, you really can abstract that there is a rural renaissance in the making. All of us are in rural communities for a reason. There are things we love about the life of rural communities: lower crime, lower cost of living, higher quality of life, family-oriented, environmental connections. I've been bunking with Mike Graham, who some of you will hear from in the fisheries section tomorrow, and he said this morning that he lives in a very depopulated or low-populated area of Newfoundland, but he loves the fact in the morning that he wakes up, can go outside and talk with the whales and the sea creatures. That is not possible in the city. There is a certain reason why we are here and a reason why we want to stay here. If, and this is the important if the economy works. Now that brings me then to the further good news, because despite all the hype about globalization, there are trends in the global economy, particularly in developed countries like Canada, that actually favor rural communities and localization. There's about 12 of these trends that I could talk about. I don't have enough time. I just want to talk about maybe 3 of them. The first is that all industrialized countries are moving from goods-based economies to service-based economies. Now, there are many reasons why people complain about this. Many service jobs have lower wages than manufacturing jobs, but actually that isn't true for all services. Professional services, financial services pay very well. But this is the reality. And what is great news about this for rural communities is that services are inherently local. People want to get their services from someone they know and trust. Yes, there is a little bit of service provision on the internet. I don't know how many of you will get your back massages over the internet. It's very popular in Washington, but we're a little weird that way. But you can see on this graph here that when I was born in the madman late 50s, early 60s, 1/3 of American family spending went to services. Today it's closer to 2/3. And this is largely true of Canada as well. So that remaining third of goods, the orange there is of what are called non-durable goods, things we consume a lot of. And the little category in the bottom is durable goods, things we hang on to for a long time like electronics or cars. So what's interesting there is that you see that what we spend in dollar value in the non-durables is 3 times greater than what we spend on the electronics. Well, again, this is also really good news for rural communities. And the reason is that non-durable goods have one overriding characteristic, and I'm talking about things like food and building materials and paper, things we run through all the time. These things are relatively heavy and have a relatively low dollar value per unit weight. Well, food, for example, is mostly water, right? So it doesn't make sense to ship water all around the world. Especially, which brings me to my second point, in an era where oil prices over time are likely to rise. Now, there are skeptics on this, but you in Canada are not among them, because in the western provinces, you've put all your investment, all your chips, on the fact that oil prices are going to rise, and that's why Alberta is going to be king. If oil prices rise, again, great news, because all of these durable goods that you are importing, you're going to start producing for yourselves right here in Nova Scotia. And that's 3/4 of the goods economy. So the only thing really we're going to be importing over the long haul that you can't really localize at the rural level are these durable products. But even there are some possibilities. So I want to point out my third trend, which is the growth of home-based businesses. I am a home-based business person. I've worked most of my professional life at home. Here are my 3 colleagues, Rachel, Adam, and Dog. They're a little older now, but one of the reasons I like a home-based business is that, you can mix family and work life more easily. Home-based businesses are an incredibly powerful transformation in the offing for rural communities. Because if you have internet connectivity, you can do almost anything in any part of the economy from your home in a rural area. And so if you think about it, a generation ago, the only kinds of jobs you could contemplate in a rural community were those that were tightly linked with natural resources, fishing or mining or forestry, maybe some slightly adjacent jobs like tourism. Today, you can be a stockbroker from right here. You can be an artist, a garage band, and sell your stuff over the internet. So the horizon of opportunities, of job opportunities in remote rural places has opened up. Well, that is incredibly powerful, because what it means is that many of the old theories about cities as the center of the economy are no longer valid. And it also means that people can increasingly choose to live in a place that they love and build their work life in any of these sectors around this. This then leads me then to how can you make this prosperous economy happen right here, right now? So last night I went through a list of 6 Ps, and since a number of you were not here, I'll just review them briefly. I put them all as Ps, so they're easy to remember. planning, people, partners, purchasing, and policymaking. Planning means identifying all the leaks in your economy, all the places where you are unnecessarily buying outside goods and services or unnecessarily investing in non-local businesses and plugging those leaks, creating new local businesses to meet that demand. People is generating a new group of entrepreneurs to lead those leak-plugging businesses. Partners is creating networks of local business that are more competitive as a team than they would be operating on their own. Purse is about how do we harness our savings and put it to use in those new local businesses. Purchasing is how we help those local businesses thrive through more local purchasing. It may go through campaigns like Think Local First or the 10% shift. And finally, policymaking is how can we get government to, number one, get rid of all of the biases in law that favor non-local business today. And number two, what are some specific ways they can help promote this agenda? Now, unfortunately, what I have seen over the last 15 years when I've been on the bully pulpit doing this is that the first response of groups when they try to build local economies is to go to foundations and wealthy people and beg for money, or go to government and beg for grants and say, help us do this agenda. I understand the impulse. I spent the first half of my adult life raising money from foundations and was not so bad at it. But there's a better way, and it's called business. All of us have to go back to business school. All of us have to think about how do we engage in these business building activities in a way that cash flows, so that we don't care if our government cancels the existing economic development program. That happens. It happens all the time, everywhere. It happens from foundations that cancel our grants. But if you have an underlying business that can support the work year in, year out, you're in a much more powerful position to implement this agenda. That is, for me, the concept of a pollinator business. A pollinator business is a business with an economic development mindset. It is a business with a mission of supporting other local businesses. And it is self-financing. Now imagine if we had in our economy a bunch of these pollinator businesses that were self-financing. Well, the advantage is that they're not vulnerable to these mercurial decisions by foundations or governments. They are able to continue growing, and they have a way of spreading and allowing economic development to proceed at a much quicker pace than it would otherwise. It also enables us to walk the talk. And if we are about supporting local business, we ought to be local business, because our mindset is fundamentally more in gear with what we're talking about. So I want to give you, and this is what I do in my book, except rather than doing it in 200 pages, I'm going to do it in 20 minutes, is I want to give you a taste of pollinators in 5 of the P's. Now, public policy, the 6th P, is not really space for pollinator because it's, by definition, the public. It's not private sector. But I will finish with some ideas about public policy anyway. So let's talk about what are some examples of pollinator businesses that you might be inspired by and implement here in Nova Scotia. So planning. And by planning, I mean not just economic planning or business planning, I also mean spatial planning. This guy, Eric Koster, is a natural entrepreneur. He was running a lemonade stand when he was 7 and then got arrested for it. And ever since, he's been trying to fight the Goliaths who get in the way of small business. He went to law school. And he has a very interesting idea that he's implementing through a business called the Main Street Genome Project. And he's interested in the fact that businesses have a short life expectancy. Small, local business startups have a short life expectancy. And if you think about it, we as people, 100 years ago, we had a much shorter life expectancy. But through data gathering, we were able to figure out ways of focusing our health efforts and improving our life expectancy. So he's asking the question, how can we gather data from local businesses and feed it back to them so that their life expectancy gets longer? He is now working with a bunch of businesses, primarily in the Washington, D.C. area, collecting data about their vendors. Right now, he's working with 300 restaurants in the district. And from that, the deal he makes with each restaurant is, give us your data for free. Then we will put it all together, and we will go to your vendor representing the bunches of local businesses that those vendors are doing business with, and we will help to equalize the costs and bring them down. And then the savings are split between Main Street Genome and the other business. So it doesn't actually cost the business anything for this service. It's a great idea, and he now has 20 staff people. He's going to be expanding into health and medicine businesses. He's got investors like Steve Case putting money into him, and he's going to be moving into other areas. But I think the broad idea is that there are ways that we can make existing businesses much more competitive if we work with them. Guy Bazzani is a great green designer in Grand Rapids, Michigan. As you know, many cities in Michigan are in bad shape, like Detroit, because they were dependent idiotically on one industry, like autos, and then as that industry left, they were left with nothing because they never did diversification and self-reliance. Grand Rapids is a better story, in part because Guy is a brilliant green designer. He has done $45 million worth of green design in the city. And he basically, does massive redevelopment projects that are all about creating walkable, more local business-oriented communities. One community is built around a street ironically called Wealthy Street because it's one of the poorest areas in the community. 10 years ago, the most regular sound you would hear around Wealthy Street were gunshots. Guy built his headquarters there, both his home on the top and his office on the bottom. He created the first LEED. So LEED is a standard from the Green Business Council that helps to determine standards about green buildings. It's the first LEED building in Grand Rapids. When he opened it up, he expected 150 people to come to his party. He got 600. The interest was unbelievable. And since then, he's done 27 buildings in Wealthy Street, and Wealthy Street is now thriving. In fact, during the Great U.S. Recession, when property values around the country dropped by 30, 40, 50%, the property values of Wealthy Street dropped by 2%. Gilbert Roches-Couste is one of the most interesting men I've ever met. He's in Melbourne. He comes from an island called Mauritius, He moved to Australia as a kid and became, in his early 20s, the manager of the largest shopping mall in the Southern Hemisphere. He did great at that job, but after a while he started to feel like, shopping malls are really sucking the blood out of the city. And in the city of Melbourne, you could see that after about 5 o'clock, the city was absolutely dead. And the only things that were still happening in the city were the social pathologies that cities hate, but most people were living along the periphery. So Gilbert, after a kind of, mind-blowing swim with the dolphins, decided to shift jobs and open up a business, a pollinator business called the Village Well. And his first project was to redesign the laneways inside Melbourne. And these are alleyways that, used to be just empty places where people hung out and maybe trash was lying there. And he converted these alleyways into new civic centers. And then he converted a public marketplace into a night market. And then he converted an old shopping mall into an outdoor mall with great piazzas. So he has fundamentally transformed Melbourne so that various magazines now consider it one of the most livable cities in the world. And what he does is not only create these majestic new islands of civic life, but he also reduces the crime. He has brought people back to live there. He has created thousands of jobs as a result, almost all of them rooted in local business. And his ideas of how to bring back to life dead spaces in communities are now being employed all over the world. Purchasing pollinators. Now, one of the first things that local activists like to do when they form a group is to encourage people to buy local. But how can you do this in a business framework? Well, one example is the Edible magazine. The Edible magazine is a franchise. It was started in Arizona. It has since moved to Connecticut. And there are 85 licensees throughout North America, including a bunch of Canadians. And it's a template. It's a beautiful template, beautiful magazine, but each local group kind of creates its own stories around local food. And the advertising inside the magazine is what creates the cash flow to support it. So the advertising, some of it is local, and some of it is actually derived from the national office. And the national office also has created great brand awareness around these edible magazines. They recently converted a struggling television show that was called Victory Gardens, and it was just about home gardening. It's now been retitled Victory Gardens Edible Feast, and Edible Feast is the home site of all of this. And so they have regular stories that reach most of the viewing audiences in Canada and the United States about local food successes that are written about in the magazines. Loyalty cards. So the top card is a loyalty card in Portland called Supportland. Every time you use this card at a local business, you gather what are called merits, which lead to discounts at other local businesses. There are hundreds of local businesses involved in this program, and there are 80,000 active users of Supportland right now. And Supportland is now in the process of spreading this technology to other U.S. cities. Bernal Bucks is a local debit card. It comes from a credit union in San Francisco, a neighborhood in San Francisco called Bernal Heights. And like most debit cards, every time you use it, there's a fee that goes back to the bank. But in this case, the bank was smart enough to actually give the fee to the local business group. And that is what then allows the local business group to hire the staff to then educate the card users on how to better use that card at local businesses. This guy, Colin Pape, is a Canadian. He comes from an Ontario community called Midland with about 16,000 people. His parents owned a paint store that did very well. He kind of grew up with small business discussions around the table. And then in the year 2000, Walmart and other chains rolled into town, and he decided, he was a hacker, he was going to fight them online. So he created a business called Shop City. And Shop City is now operating in 25 Canadian cities and 15 American cities. And so, for example, you can go to shopmidland.com, where there are now 2,000 local businesses that are listed there, and those businesses all pay modest fees to help where Colin helps them create their entries onto the site. And as I said, this is a very viable business model promoting local purchasing all across Canada and the United States. People pollinators. So people is all about supporting entrepreneurship. How do you support entrepreneurship in a self-financing way? Well, this woman is my boss. She is Nicole Chaland. She is the head of Simon Fraser University's Community Economic Development Program. And she negotiated with Simon Fraser a new way of doing the program where she is more independent, she has more control over the money, she has lower overhead. She's still awarding degrees in community economic development that 12 of us teach courses in, myself included. And she brings 2 to 3 cohorts of 25 people a year into the course and teaches them all about local economic development. And if you folks are interested in this, let me know and I will help to connect you to Nicole. Older people are not the only ones who want to learn about entrepreneurship. This picture comes from Paraguay, where a high school run by a foundation called Fundacio Paraguaya teaches high school classes of about 50 to 100 people a year how to run 16 farm businesses. These businesses are not just models, they actually are working businesses. So a student before graduation would have experience running a hotel, running a restaurant, running a dairy business, working in the farmer's market. As a result of the income flow from these businesses, this high school is totally 100% self-financing. And it has gotten so much attention that it is now spreading in Paraguay, spreading in Tunisia. There are even groups thinking about bringing it to the United States. Co-working spaces, impact hubs are being set up around the world. There's 63 of them so far. And basically they charge membership fees or rent to bring together social entrepreneurs who can learn as a team. Some groups also go further and create maker spaces to help people who are actually building things, and there are models of maker spaces that are self-financing as well. Incubators. There are 1,000 incubators in North America, and nearly all of them depend on government grants or foundation money. But one example of an incubator that is self-financing that I think is fascinating is Fledge in Seattle. Fledge is run by this guy, Michael Looney Libes, and Looney is his nickname. And he doesn't believe in business acceleration as usual. A business incubator as usual. A typical incubator will have a business stick around on premises for 2-3 years before graduation. He thinks that's way too long. So he actually pays businesses $20,000 each to come and work with him intensively for 2 months. And at the end of that, he takes a couple of percentage points of equity in the company as payment for it. And that company then pays him back through a small royalty type on their gross revenues for several years. It is a brilliant revenue model, and frankly, one that we should use for all kinds of economic development. Partnerships. So partnerships, again, are where local businesses work together to be more competitive as a team than they would be apart. This woman here, Stephanie Jackman, runs a network of BALI, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, in Calgary. And she is one of the few BALI networks that is 100% self-financing. And she's done this with just 120 members. How has she done this? Well, she has basically created a fabulous service for her members. She provides them with all kinds of marketing assistance. She is their one-stop shop for advertising. And she has developed relationships, for example, with local radio stations and the local newspapers that give these businesses low-dollar, discounted access to media resources they never would have had otherwise. Tucson Originals, I mentioned this last night, is a group of restaurants in Tucson, Arizona. Right now, there are 42 restaurants in the association. These restaurants collectively buy $80 million of stuff each year, mostly food. What they've really smartly done is that they've pooled their purchasing together, and they go to vendors and they get discounts and rebates that really make it worthwhile for these groups to be part of the team. So imagine, you're creating this kind of pollinator for local businesses in this region here. So you collectively buy things together and bring down the input prices. Public markets is another form of partnership. Now, the public in public markets is a little bit of a misnomer. It doesn't refer to the ownership of the market, but more to its mission. And, public markets can be thought of in the same way as farmers markets or flea markets or night markets or informal markets. But public markets are permanent spaces where local businesses exist under one roof and collectively sell stuff, and they create great destinations. So I have a picture here of Pike's Market, Pike's Place in Seattle. No tourist ever can miss Pike's Place, and one of the things that happens there is, the first thing you see is the local fishermen who are tossing around big fish in an entertaining way. What is going to be your local business mall here? What's going to be your public market? Purse. I have a couple of Canadian examples in my book around Purse, and one of them is Van City. Van City is, in my view, one of the greatest credit unions in the world. HSBC brags in its advertising, we are the world's local bank, even though there's not a shred of local in it. This is the real local bank of the world. It is the second largest credit union in Canada. Desjardins in Quebec is significantly larger, but they have assets of about $18 billion. They provide every conceivable service that a regular bank has, only their customers are much more satisfied. There are 500,000 members in Vancouver in Van City, and about 38,000 of them are businesses. This woman, Maureen Cureton, is probably the most important economic developer in Vancouver because she is in charge of promoting green businesses. And she works with all of the businesses that are involved in Van City and helps spread recycling technology, helps link businesses together in partnerships. Van City is a business pollinator. You have one of the best business pollinators I know in the world, and that is Linda Best and FarmWorks. You folks created the CEDIF program, Community Economic Development Investment Funds. It has spread to 60 funds in this province, and people are increasingly beginning to use it. Not enough, it's growing slowly. But in my mind, these community investment funds are fabulous models. You should grow these models. You should be proud of these models. You should start putting your money into FarmWorks and related things if you're not already. And by the way, you do get a 30% tax credit if you leave your pension funds in there for a long enough period of time. By the way, if the United States had as many community development funds as Nova Scotia did per capita, we would have 21,000 of them. Today we have almost none. Local pre-purchasing. This is my last example of a pollinator. This guy is Arno Hess, a German-American. He created a website called Credibles. And Credibles lists a bunch of local food businesses where you can pre-purchase in bulk certain things, and when you pre-purchase them, you get a discount. Well, think about it. Pre-purchasing gives capital in advance to businesses. And it's one way you can promote local investment without involving pricey securities attorneys. I want to just say one quick word about policy. Even though public policymakers cannot run pollinators, there is a role for public policy. And that role is to figure out how you can be nurturing, supportive of them, without spending a lot of public money, because we know you have almost no public money for economic development right now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of all money in the province that's being given away to non-local businesses. Voila! I have just saved you tens of millions of dollars that can be used for pollinators. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that all local governments are doing their banking with local banks or credit unions. Now, if you think this is a radical idea, one of the governments that did this just in the United States is the home of Barry Goldwater in Phoenix, Arizona, where the city council just moved $50 million into a local bank, and that local bank is now promised to do all kinds of local reinvestment as a result of that shift of capital. The third thing you're going to do is have your governments start to follow the initiatives of Gregor Robinson in Vancouver to do more local procurement from the government. So the government gets on the right side of supporting local businesses. And I have ideas about how to do that cost effectively. And the last thing you're going to do is start lobbying provincial authorities to do the right thing in other areas. So, for example, you have yet to finalize a crowdfunding reform, and I'm delighted that in my small group on local investing that we're about to have, we have a representative there from the Nova Scotia Securities Commission who you can chat with and share some ideas with on how crowdfunding ought to look. The bottom line, and this is my other repeat slide from last night, is to focus. Pollinators are challenging. Pollinators might cost a little bit of money to get started, But the amount of money and the challenge is a lot less than what you've been doing already with non-local businesses. But to do it, you can't waste all your money and time on the wrong things. You have to start focusing on what we know that works. I have tried to give you an idea of how local economic development can proceed. And everything you need for successful local economic development is right here. I want to conclude with a children's story that I conclude the end of Dollars, Local Sense with. And it's a book called A Blue So Blue by Jean-Francois Dumont. And it's a story of a boy who's obsessed with painting the color blue. And everywhere he goes, he paints blue. But there's one color of blue that mesmerizes him, that comes to him in his sleep, and he can't figure out where this blue has come from. And he sets out on an international journey to find the color of blue. He goes to the Louvre to look at the paintings of the great masters. Can't find the blue. He goes on an ocean journey, looks for patches of water that might have that blue. Can't find it there. He goes to a blues bar in New Orleans. Nope, not there. And then he goes to the desert where a blue-hooded stranger says, "What you've been looking for may never have been very far away." And suddenly it dawns on the boy. The blue he was looking for, the blue that had so mesmerized him, was the blue in his mother's eyes. And so often, we in economic development forget that everything we need is right here. The pollinator examples I've given you today are not imaginary, they all are existing. But they're existing in different places. You folks here in Nova Scotia have the possibility to actually put them all into place in one location and see the power of multiple pollinators. The rest is up to you. Thank you.